So, good morning, everyone. Is this the last research? No, the one before the last one, Research Forum. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Alba Lanau. She is currently Ramon y Cajal researcher in this department. She joined us in January last year. So this is her second academic year here. And she's also tenure track, which means that she hopefully will stay with us. She's a sociologist. She holds a PhD in sociology by the University of Bristol. No? In social policy. I'm sorry. In social policy. Now I thought the mistake was the university. But she did her undergraduate studies here at UPF before moving to the UK. And in that PhD and afterwards, she has been working mostly on poverty, which is the topic she will be talking about today. And she combines both quantitative methods and qualitative methods to deal with these topics and others. And I think it's also the approach she has decided for today's talk, where she basically will present recent work already published and ongoing work of the project he's now leading at Autónoma University and with funding from the Barcelona City Council. So without further words, I leave the word to her to continue introducing herself and her work, and I hope you all enjoy. And we can have the discussion afterwards. She will take around 45 minutes, 40 to 45, and then we have time, as you know, for exchanging. Go ahead.
Yes, I think this is working now. Hi, everyone. I'm going to stand because I'm a ball of nerves, so I hope that's okay. Shorter, closer. Okay, not very convenient. I'll do my best. I'll feel like a star. So welcome, everyone. I'm going to, as Clara said, I'm going to be talking about poverty today, and I'm going to do three things. I'm going to do first a mini crash course on poverty, just because I'm not sure everyone here has kind of like been introduced to the topic before. And then I'll present an article that was published last month in Work Poverty Dynamics, and that takes a quantitative perspective. And then I'll present some ongoing work from a qualitative project that is, they're both related. They both have to do with the second part of the title. So why are people poor, and particularly why are people poor? If we think about it from a dynamic perspective, means why do people enter poverty? How do people exit poverty? Who does and who doesn't? Right? So those are the kind of questions that we're going to be talking about today. But before I start with that, I want to start by saying that poverty is a political issue, and it's political in a number of ways, right? It's political because who we define as poor, what we define poverty to be, depends on our normative values. Yes, and here we can go from like very narrow understandings of extreme poverty as people who don't have enough food to eat or homeless, to the approach to poverty that we use in the European Union, which is relative poverty, and it's inspired by Townsend's definition you have here, which is people are poor when they can't participate in the normal activities of the society in which they live. This definition has also been taken by the UN, and essentially the idea here is that poverty is about being a member of society, right? It's been operationalized in many ways. Usually we try to capture what's a minimum decent standard of living, and I will show you one of the definitions that I'm using, which is the official EU definition. But I think a good thing to have in mind is, despite the fact that lots of researchers will use different measures of poverty, and those will result in different estimates, the groups who identify as poor, the factors we associate with poverty are always the same. Those does not vary when we change the indicator, right? So lone mothers are consistently poor, etc., etc. Another reason why poverty is political is that defining someone as poor implies a moral obligation for us to act. And if we think about it from a perspective of the welfare state, who the state defines is poor, in our case, for example, who has an income below the ingreso mínimo vital threshold, that's who we assign this right, yes, to receive public support. There are more reasons it's political. We will go on in a minute. Another reason it's political. Poverty has lots to do with our value system, right? And when I like doing these mini introductions, because when I talk about poverty, or when I tell people in the street, I am a poverty researcher, one of the main responses I get is like, well, things along the lines of people don't want to work, people don't organize themselves well, and there's this kind of narratives, right? Of like, there's all of this, what we call in the literature, the poverty myths, like assumptions about why people are poor. In addition to the myths, we also have a ton of research on poverty and things that we know, things where there's a consensus, right? So in terms of why are people, starting to answer the question, why are people poor? I'm going to focus particularly in Spain here. And so if we think about why poverty rates are high in Spain, we can think about it from a static perspective. So right now, why we have high poverty rates. And from a static perspective, if we go to the aggregate level, we can think, okay, poverty rates in Spain are high because we have a weak labor market. That's one of the consensus, right? We also have a weak welfare state that has very limited capacity to lift families out of poverty. Those are the main determinants. We're very sensitive to crisis as well. So in Spain, whenever there's a recession, lots of people enter poverty. Whenever there's a time of economic growth, we lift less people of poverty and they enter during the recession. Then from an individual perspective, we are quite clear on what the determinants of poverty are, right? Earlier, I talked about being a single mother, but we can think about low educational attainment. We can think about migration. Yes, there's all of these determinants that you've probably heard about. But what happens if we take a dynamic perspective to poverty? So if we don't think just, okay, why we have so many people, but also which are the routes by which people enter and exit poverty, right? So why do households, and I'm talking about households because when we talk about poverty, we're always talking about households, yes? Why do households become poor? Why do we talk about households? Because households share resources, yes? They share their needs, they share their resources. So it doesn't make sense to think of an individual as poor. Otherwise, for example, children would all be poor because they don't earn, right? So it makes sense that okay. So thinking about this dynamic perspective, I'll present to you these two projects, which I've introduced already earlier. And before doing that, I want to do my crash course on poverty. It has 4 slides, it's quick, and hopefully it's useful. So the first thing to know about poverty in Spain is that poverty in Spain is a structural phenomenon. This is data from the INE. You'll see the figure is cut, but essentially poverty rates in Spain, regardless of the economic cycle, are between 20 and 22%. So we don't seem to lower them much. They don't seem to go farther up. And this is not just a statistical artifact. This is something that regardless of the measure we use, we observe certain level of continuity. So lesson 1, we have high poverty rates as well. So poverty in Spain is higher than in other European countries. We're here just behind Bulgaria, Romania, and Latvia in terms of our poverty rates. And it is so consistently over time, as I've shown before. And there's at least two interesting things more to see in this figure. So we have not only very high poverty rates, but also we have very low pensioner poverty, which is the little empty triangle thing. So here, and we have very high child poverty rates. So Spain has the second highest child poverty rate in the EU. and it is quite high compared to countries around us. And this is another way in which poverty is political. Pensioner poverty, before we established the pension system, was much higher than it is now, right? As a welfare state, we've made the decision to reduce poverty amongst pensioners. However, we had not made this decision for families with children. And that explains our exceptionally high child poverty rates. And that explains also why I'm going to be talking to you about child poverty. The third kind of like takeaway message has to do with, okay, so who are the people at risk of poverty in Spain? Children, as I've already discussed. And second is workers. So Spain has one of the highest in-work poverty rates in the EU. We have more poor workers. That has to do with the weak labor market we talked about earlier, to the extent that 7 out of 10 children in poverty are in working households. Yes, so in-work poverty and child poverty, even though they may seem as very different phenomenon, in our case, they're extremely intertwined in our country. That's not the case in other countries. As we've seen, some of the countries have extremely low poverty rates and even lower child poverty rates. So what am I talking to you today about? Child poverty and in-work poverty. Excellent. First paper. Now you all have your crash course on poverty. This is joint work with Mariona Lozano at the Centre d'Estudis Demogràfics, and we published it last month. Happy to talk about later or more if you want. But I'm just going to give you an overview. Which data do we use? We use the Spanish version of the European Living Conditions Survey. This is the official source for statistics on income and poverty in the EU. We use both cross-sectional and longitudinal data, you will see. And important thing to notice about these dates is that we are working with the period 2015-2020. So we are both pre-pandemic, and with 2020, we're completely pre-pandemic because the income data in the SILC refers to the previous year. So completely pre-pandemic, and also pre-changes that have happened in the welfare state in the last few years. In Spain, since the pandemic, particularly the introduction of the Ingreso Mínimo Vital. Yeah, so we're not going to be seeing any of that, and I'm happy to talk about it later. But in these data, there's none of that. And it's actually quite convenient if we think about studying dynamics and kind of like trying to understand how things work in normal times. So we analyze households, as already discussed, with a working age person. And so for a household to be defined as in-work poverty, they need to have at least one worker. And a worker is someone who works 7 months or more, a year, not a month, a year, right? Meaning we just want to identify as workers those who are mostly workers, because the idea is that work needs to lift you out of poverty. And you're poor if your household has an income below the poverty threshold, which is a 60% official threshold of the EU. Again, we could have different thresholds. The results wouldn't be very different. Questions and hypotheses. I'm going to deal with 3 questions today. First, how dynamic is in-work poverty? That is, how many people enter and exit. Second, what are the most common routes into and out of in-work poverty in Spain? Why do people become poor or stop being poor? And also, what factors explain the concentration of poverty in households with children? Why do we have this high prevalence? And here, I'll contrast 3 sets of hypotheses from the literature. My plan is to kind of like jump ahead and present methods and results at the same time. And then, of course, if there's questions, we can always go back. Okay, so message number 1 from the article, in-work poverty is very dynamic. If you look at, this is the number of years that households spend in poverty. We have a maximum of 3+ years because the panel component of the EU SILC only has 4 years. So I can't have any more. And you will see that in general, 40% of the population, more or less, 43% of the population spends a single year in poverty of the 3 of the years we experience, we explore, so these 4 years we observe. 26%, 2 years, so half the time, and only 30% are 3 or more years in poverty. Meaning or challenging, essentially, one of the preconceptions we often have that poverty, like people who are poor, the poor is a static category, right? Like we have, at least in Spain, but also in other countries, I've also done this research in the UK, happy to talk about that as well. People enter and exit poverty in relatively short periods of time. However, poverty is less dynamic in households with children. So one of the reasons actually we have more children in poverty or more households with children is that they spend longer periods in this condition. Idea number 2 of the paper. Okay, here we get a bit more complex. We're trying to understand which are the events, which are the factors that explain these poverty entries and exits. And to do so, I use trigger analysis, which is a methodology developed by Jenkins, an economist, and that we adapted with Rod Hick in order to be able to study inward poverty specifically. The key idea is that you separate events associated with poverty entries. So which changes do people experience that make them enter poverty, and exits. And we distinguish between 3 types of events. We distinguish between labor market events. So for example, someone enters the labor market, or someone exits the labor market, or someone has a period of unemployment, or switches from full-time to part-time, all of these kind of things. Second, demographic events. So that can be a divorce, or it can be a birth. So there's increase or decrease in the number of people in the household. Yes. And then the third category is non-earned income events. So things that can increase household income. For example, I'm able to rent a house and get the money from that, but also mostly benefits, yes, that are not related to the labor market, to my working hours. We accept households experience usually multiple events at once. So for example, if there's a divorce, I will lose a member, but probably I will also lose hours of work, a worker. Yes. And so events are non-exclusive, and percentages then don't add to 100. And when I talk about changes in income, we have kind of like this caveat of at least 10% and at least 50 euros to avoid like small variations resulting in poverty entries and exits. Okay. So this is a descriptive technique. We can't ascertain causality, but we observe which events co-occur with poverty entries and exits. So in a way, it gives us the maximum. And for each event, we calculate 3 statistics: incidence, how frequent is the event in the population; rate, which is the risk of transition into poverty for those who experience the event; and share, which is which proportion of entries or exit co-occur with the event. I find the share the most interesting one often, and it's the one I'm going to mostly focus on. I have one of these awful tables that everyone hates. It's here for transparency purposes, but I'm going to walk you through the bits that I consider, it is way too small, but over the bits I consider maybe the most relevant. The first message here is that the majority of entries are associated with changes in the labor market. So entering poverty has to do with labor market events. And this is important because part of the narrative of why are people poor is, and why are people with children poor as well? They have too many children, or even they have one child and that may cause them to enter poverty. And we find increases in the number of children are associated with an increased risk of poverty, but it's like around 10% of those who have one more child in the household, be it birth or adoption, become poor. And it explains 12%, maximum 12% of all the poverty entries. But if we look at things, for example, changes in the number of hours worked, 65% experience a decrease in salary, 31% experience a decrease in the number of employees, 27% experience a decrease in salary without reduction of workers or months, right? So the main trigger events associated with poverty entries are these decreases in salary and decreases in the number of workers. However, benefits also play an important role, and we see that around a third of those households who become poor experience a decrease in benefits. And this points to a failure of our benefit system, by which people stop receiving benefits while they are still poor. And this is mostly unemployment benefits. Around 28% is unemployment. Like unemployment finishes and there's nothing to replace it that keeps the household out of poverty. Similar story for poverty exits. People exit poverty through increases in their salary mostly. Around 18% gain a worker, 20% gain an employee, 37% increase their salary without increasing hours or employees, meaning they either are self-employed and are earning more, they have irregular income, or they get a job that pays more, they get, etc. Changes in other income are also surprising, and this is a bit we don't know about very much, but changes in other income is essentially things such as receiving non-benefit and non-salary income, so either dividends or rent and things like that. And we observe around 17% of our people exiting poverty experience an increase in other income. That's a puzzle we don't have an answer to, but if any of you has ideas later, very happy. Okay, so in sum, inward poverty transitions are mainly associated with labor market events. And changes in benefits are also important, and I highlight this because it's not often recognized in the literature. Third question, what about this increased risk for households with children? The literature has three main explanations. The first one is the mechanical explanation I mentioned earlier. You have a child, all of a sudden you have more needs, yes? And then as a result, you become poor. So this first explanation, the literature, well, the evidence doesn't seem to fit this first explanation. There is no evidence of a strong mechanical effect in Spain, right? Because we have few people, like the frequency of the event is low, but also the risk associated with the event is low. So we had this 12% of entries only maximum associated with having a child. So it seems that demographic factors, no, we could run out this. Second explanation is a selection effect. So people who have children are different from people who don't have children, right? We know people who have children to be, so for example, let's take it the other way around. That's sounds better. So we know women who are highly educated, for example, have less children on average, right? So we could see, okay, people who are lowerly educated are more likely to be poor and to have children. And to check that partially, we run kind of like this regression model where we are like, okay, so we look at the employment in the household, we look at the number of workers, we look at the education, we look at the tenure in the household, we control by all the factors we can imagine. And even after controlling for all these factors, we still find households with children to be more likely to become poor and less likely to exit poverty. So yes, there is some selection effect, but it's not the whole story. Explanation number 3, or set of explanation number 3, is the motherhood penalty. And I've summarized as the motherhood penalty. We could call it the child penalty. But it's the idea that households with children accumulate difficulties over time, right? It becomes harder for them to exit poverty because their mother's salary goes down as a result of childbirth, discrimination, etc., but also because they become less flexible, less able to adapt to changes, right? If I have a child, I can't move so easily, I can't have any sort of hours, etc., etc. And we do find some evidence of that. We find that households with children are less likely to exit poverty even after a positive event. So gaining a worker is less likely to lift them out of poverty, for example. Permanent contracts are less protective of households with children. And this is particularly complicated for large families. They're very, very unlikely to exit poverty regardless of the number of positive events. So there's also some kind of like demographic factor here. But together, these point towards a process of erosion, even though we can't explain precisely how it occurs, and Q will have the qualitative to do some of that. Okay. Ta-da! Qualitative part. Okay, so this is, now that we know about poverty, we know about in-work poverty dynamics, this is my next project. It's currently a small project with the City Council, but I've put in a ministerial project. So maybe you will hear more about this later in the future. But the project is called Child Poverty in Neighborhood Opportunity Structures, and we look at essentially the factors that explain why households, whose households are poor, and how do they manage poverty essentially. So in terms of background, we depart from three theoretical ideas or main perspectives. The first one is that, as discussed, poverty is a dynamic phenomenon. Yes, we already all sold. I see nothing. Perfect. And this idea of this process of erosion and how it works. The second idea is this notion of agency within limits. So people, when they become poor, households do not like wait for things to happen to them, but households react to income losses or job losses by activating other resources, right? And so what we're trying to capture is this agency, knowing that, and the within limits part is knowing that it's constrained by the structural factors of society, right? The third theoretical notion, and I brought that from this beautiful book here, I recommend to anyone interested in welfare states or health, because it's mostly about health, is the idea that of welfare services as a resource. So when I talked about poverty earlier, I was saying, okay, the EU poverty measure and most of the poverty measures focus on household income, right? But actually, income is not the only kind of resource that households have available to them. Households also resort, and particularly households with children, resort to public services. And we can think about health, education, nurseries, yes, to meet their needs. And so one of the things that really interests me is how can we include these elements in definitions and measures of poverty, but also as part of this process, like which role do these resources play in family strategies right now? And these are the three questions I'm going to be addressing today. I'm going in threes. I've been told it's a good thing to do in presentations. So the first one is, what does it mean to have difficulties to make ends meet in Barcelona today? Kind of like get a picture of that. And the second is, what are the strategies that households use to cope with shocks? And here, when I talk about shocks, you can think about the events we've been talking about in the quantitative part, yes? When faced with this kind of events, how do households react? And the third one is the role of public services, as already announced. Okay, so this is a qualitative project. So we do interviews. We do interviews with professionals. It's a very small project. Like it's 18 months. We're still analyzing. It's also an exploratory project in that we developed a new methodology, and I will like present that to you. And again, very happy to have comments because we're still working on it. It's also an applied project. So a part of it has to do with really developing recommendations for the city council on how to improve these kind of things, right? So we did the professional interviews, and we did then in-depth what we call event interviews. I'll show you what that means later. With families, we've interviewed 29 families in several neighborhoods in Barcelona that are in the Pla de Barris. The Pla de Barris is a Barcelona City Council initiative to address the needs of those neighborhoods that have highest poverty rates, highest unemployment rates, etc., that are defined as vulnerable. So we picked 3-4 of those neighborhoods, and then we interview households with children who are living in low-income neighborhoods, these Pla de Barri neighborhoods, and who experience difficulties to make ends meet. And here, difficulties to make ends meet is completely self-defined. Yes, we tell them this is what we're looking for, and then they identify that, and then they tell us what that means to them. Okay, so I have a few quotes, and they're all in English and in Spanish or Catalan. So you can choose which language you understand or you prefer. Bottom, red, always English. Top, usually Spanish. Okay, and So what does having difficulties to make meet in Barcelona today? We have a range. We have people for whom poverty is a very specific experience, is short-lived. And for example, here we have Daniel. He lives in a household with their 2 workers. They have 1 child, and they had difficulties to make ends meet when we interviewed him because his wife had taken an excedencia and paid leave to be able to take care of their child for a bit longer. So for a while, they had to run on 1 salary, and that wasn't enough to cover their needs. That meant they had to do without certain things that they were used to, like traveling, eating out, that we can think of as luxuries, but also use up their savings, right? So this is one extreme. The other end of this is families who talk to us about like, well, if there isn't a banana for each, we just share the banana, right? Or this Pilar, they're all pseudonyms, of course. Pilar is talking about, sometimes I bought like one of those ready-made puree things, like soups, and if there isn't enough for everyone, I'll serve it to my child, and then I'll add some water and I'll have it myself. So here with whatever's left, I'll have, right? And then it's like, and maybe I have to like have a tea to calm my stomach if I'm hungry. And Pilar is Spanish, not that it matters, but often we can associate this kind of extreme poverty, and particularly food deprivation with migrant experiences. And yes, but also not only migrant experiences. Pilar has a disability. Her husband works, but they have children and 1 child, and it's just not enough. So important things to take away from here. This is like the middle range. Important things to take care of is first, our sample is extremely diverse in terms of poverty, right? We have some extreme forms of poverty, and we have some milder forms of poverty. Second, what does it mean to be poor in Barcelona today means different things to different people. And all of these people, I've selected them because they describe their experience as, oh, we didn't have to do much, we just strengthened our belt, or we sacrificed a little. And what does it mean to strengthen your belt, to struggle? It means different things depending on your previous experience. The other reason, and that's Maria here in the middle, and she's like, she works, she went through a divorce, and in her case, she would be like, she had to really adjust things. And she's like, well, I'm talking about like, everything is tight. I don't know, like there are things that are not essential, like going out, to having a social life. But once she starts going through the list, she's like, okay, well, then I pay for everything, and then what's left for me? And she talks essentially about the impact in terms of mental health of really struggling. No? Okay. This is a bit what the result of my event interviews look like. So how do we do these interviews? We ask people to identify a specific event that they associate with economic struggle, that caused them to struggle economically, a shock. Yes. And after they identify this event, in this case was the childbirth and voluntary leave, is Daniel again that we met before. And then we wait, okay, Daniel, so what did you do in response to this event? Right? Like, how did you cope? And they will say things such as reducing expenses. That's the main thing. Using our savings, resorting to family, sometimes asking for help. And we reflect everything, or we aim to reflect everything they did, even if it didn't result in a positive outcome. So maybe I went to social services, but they didn't help me. Yeah. And the idea here is to really identify all the potential resources and which impact they have. And so in this, the other thing that's interesting about this is we have this narrative perspective, this chronological perspective over time as well. So we can see, like here with the leave, we have a bit of experience of like their situation before, then we have the leave, and then in this case we see was a very short period of poverty for them, or like low resources when they had the unpaid leave, right? These 5 months, but they already really struggled in those 5 months, partially because the situation they had before. So we try and kind of like capture everything. And I'm not going to be able to show this to you in detail, but okay. But I wanted to show you, we have a few ones that we have. We have two more. And then I'll read out to you our main takeaways so far, because I think that's a bit easier. So this is another case. This is Maria, the girl who was complaining about her not being able to do anything and how that had a negative impact on her mental health. And she divorced. And then after her divorce, she really struggled to find housing that would take her as a single mother and self-employed, right? In her case, lots of variations in employment and lots of vulnerability associated with, in lockdown, she lost all of her income and she didn't have access to protection and ERTE like employed people would. And then she had to move flat because she just couldn't afford the one she had. And then she was unemployed for a while. Like she finally managed to take a job, etc. And now she's doing better. There's like a positive experience. And she's doing better for two reasons. The first reason is she got a second job. So she's working two jobs now. And the second reason is she finally managed to get the ingreso mínimo vital, the minimum income. And that for her has been a changing, like it's changed her life. Even though it's a very small bit, she gets just the complemento de infancia, so the child bit. But because it was paid to her delayed, like she got a whole year in a month because they were delayed. It means she has savings now and they can go to the dentist. And if the children have to pay something, she doesn't need to put so much money in. So we have a positive story. And then we also have some stories that are like just narratives of precarious migration, where it's difficult to identify which event specifically resulted in vulnerability because there is such a concentration of forms of vulnerability, you know? So Salma, for example, lives with her, she came here pregnant from Morocco. She was working for a Spanish company and the Spanish company closed and they had the permit to live in Spain. And they were like, okay, we're unemployed now. We have the permit, not to live, sorry, to enter Spain. And and she was pregnant and they were like, okay, we'll go. And they just came to Spain in a very precarious way. And it's hard to tell whether the precarity started before they came or, but in any case, there's also all of these kind of like different events that we can identify. Okay, so what are the main takeaway? How does this help us with answering our questions? One of the first things is public services are really central to family strategies. Here we haven't, I don't think they maybe were highlighted so much in the ones I showed, but all families talk about education and health particularly as being central to how they manage poverty. And it happens in ways that we may not see. And this is a quote I really like, is Leah, she's from Malaga, but she came here when she was 1 year old and she's lived in Roquetas her whole life. And she's talking about the nursery and they're like, oh, today's a great day. We're celebrating the nursery, getting into nursery essentially because there aren't enough public nursery spots in Barcelona, right? And it's like, goes like, okay, yeah, that's a great thing. And then what would have happened if you didn't get into nursery? And she's like, well, I would have had to quit my job. And this is something that we don't observe in poverty transitions research, in poverty measures, but that has a clear impact of like public services into the risk of poverty for families, right? Because it will be a family that has one worker and two children, and all of a sudden a much harder situation. Education and healthcare also act as entry points for access to other services, community services, social services, etc., etc. And we also observe huge differences between neighborhoods, and particularly in our case, Besos, which is one of the poorest neighborhoods, we observe also a huge gap in terms of services. To give you an example, Ciutat Bella has 5 nurseries, like for city council nurseries. Besos has 0. There isn't a single city council nursery in one of the poorest neighborhoods with lots of children. And that, of course, will have an impact on how families are able to cope. Other implications. So I think qualitative findings illustrate the experience of living in income poverty in Barcelona and challenges some of the misconceptions. Misconceptions such as well, poverty here is not that severe, right? That I often find like, well, like poverty statistics are a lie because actually we're not, the people who are poor don't really struggle. I think that's one thing. The other thing is this idea that people are waiting to be helped. No, we see, and that's why I wanted to show you kind of like the events. Families do so many things in order to avoid poverty, in order to cope with economic conditions. They also illustrate how events co-occur, partially as these responses of families. They create more and more events. So it's really useful to think about poverty as a process. Another interesting thing I'm learning, because I'm learning loads from this project, is that some key events that families identify as trigger in this entering into poverty are not captured by poverty measures. And that includes things such as losing access to food aid, for example, in kind benefits, but also like the nursery example I gave you, right? Like that could be an exit or an entry that we would never capture. But above all, families often observe these increasing costs as a key trigger. And in the case of Barcelona, housing costs are a key trigger of difficult situations, but also in lately the inflation crisis, no increases in like all sorts of other costs. We can think electricity, food, etc., depends on where you are. But essentially, we are observing a process of poverty above the poverty line. No, people who wouldn't be defined as poor, like Maria, for example, our friend by now, she's on 22K, plus she has a second job. She would definitely be above the poverty line, and yet her experience, it is not of comfort. And that has lots to do with the fact that we exclude costs, particularly housing costs, from the picture. Okay, so I am on 40 minutes and I'm going to give you the conclusions and then let you ask questions or complain. So why are people poor? In the case of Spain, the labor market is really like, no surprises here, I suppose, but it's really a key determinant of poverty dynamics. Both short periods of unemployment and income changes result in explain the majority of poverty entries and exits. Poverty is also a result of cumulative processes, and it's important to take into consideration both income and non-income resources, and also potentially costs. And this is something that we are debating in the community in a way. The importance of agency is for me another of the takeaways. Like families really react to events with everything they've got. And this idea of bricolage, of families putting together, cobbling together resources from different origins in order to deal with complex situations rather than wait for help. This idea de la paguita, no? People are waiting that there's a transfer. That doesn't seem to be the case, regardless of who you talk to. And households with children, we observe, on the one hand, increased constraint. Again, I haven't been able to show you all the data, but there's lots of data of why don't you work, what are the difficulties, which kind of jobs are you looking for? And having children really makes it harder, particularly for mothers to work when they are living in this kind of like precarious situations already in neighborhoods with limited opportunities. If we think about low educational attainment, it all adds up. And the other element is reliance on services. And I'm really, I'm really emphasizing this because I think so I'm a social policy person, as already discussed. In the context in which we are discussing about where should the welfare state go? And should we be prioritizing transfers over services? And we see how public services are slowly being dismantled. I think there's many reasons, or this research shows us there's many reasons why services are a key element of anti-poverty strategies in the welfare state. It's great to have transfers, but services play roles that transfers can't play. So in terms of like my mini recommendations for policy, we need to improve. If we needed to do two things in Spain instead of three, policies that allow combining work and benefits in more flexible ways. There seems to be an awful lot of people who enter and exit poverty through these like short unemployment spells, and also strengthening service provision. I'm going to say, particularly for families with children, since they seem to be most affected, but also we know poverty has an extreme impact on children over the long term in terms of their trajectory, health, education, etc., etc. And yeah, that was me. That's all the funders that I need to add. And I will be very happy to answer any questions, comments, discussions. Thank you very much for listening. And please use the microphone for questions. Thank you.
Yes, if I would like to, if you could elaborate a bit on the relationship between having children and poverty. Because you kind of minimize, according to your data, this relationship. But then when you were explaining, you say, no, but in fact, it is related. So how to catch it? I'm not sure how did you catch it, but many of the transitions related to having children might happen either well before having the child, for instance, the year before, because the woman is pregnant, lose her job, or goes to part-time, or after. So maybe, as you were saying, maybe the women cannot access the labor market because she has a child, and cannot have access to the nursery and so on. So then she might go to perhaps to part-time and something. So maybe one way to catch it could be, okay, what happens the year before having the child? What happens the year after having the child? Mm-hmm. Not only the year exactly in which she had the child. Well, that's it.
Are we collecting, or am I?
Yeah, I'm keeping an eye. So we have already some questions.
Okay.
Hi, Alba. Thank you for your presentation. And coming from Latin America, I'm really curious on how you measure poverty. So I have very concrete question. Literature really suggests or emphasizes that poverty is gendered and racialized. The gendered results are pretty clear, and you mentioned them in very different ways. I'm curious about the racialized component, if you have any thoughts or any evidence on that, and a specific question about this episode or this I can't think of the word this moment. I saw it on the presentation about the administrative status. If this introduces some changes, if I don't know, if you have some thoughts on that. Thank you.
Perfect.
Thank you very much, Alba, and what a relevant research. I have actually 3 questions related to the qualitative part. Is that allowed, or only 1? 2? Okay. Okay, great. So
there's a rule.
So the third one might come afterwards, then after this talk. First question, just out of curiosity, when it comes to the self-identification, have you checked, or what's your take on that at this stage of the research, on people who identify as poor or not making
having difficulties to make ends meet. Nobody identifies as poor.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. This would be already one thing, but in general, the question: do you also collect information on the income? I suppose so, or they are asked because you had some figures on income there. But what's your take on it? Like when you really look at the objective income and then how they use it. So I would be just curious to hear more about the self-identification. And the second one then. One is on your take at the current stage when it comes to systematic differences between the barrios. Mm-hmm. What I understood, that you pointed out the nursery services that were essential. Are there any other systematic differences in terms of policies, as well as on other criteria that were mentioned then by the respondents? And connected to that also, when you mentioned that there were no nurseries, but a lot of children in poverty. How did people cope? Like, what were the creative elements to that? And the very small third one is, what do you take from this qualitative research for quant, right? What survey questions do we need to actually be more clear on poverty research in the future?
Okay, I go. Those are three. Yeah, cool. Okay, thank you, Pau, for your question. Yes, like poverty doesn't. So, okay. What I mean is that poverty is not an automatic or mechanical result of having a child. And I think that's important because of some of the narratives about people are poor because they have many children. And there's this idea of being irresponsible in a way, right? Like deciding to have the child and then that throws you into poverty. And that doesn't seem to be the case. What seems to be the case is exactly what you're pointing at now, this idea of like this process of erosion, right? Like either I lose my job before or after, or I have difficulties to kind of like balance work-life balance difficulties, let's call them like that, and then I can't work to the same extent, or I lose my. But there's also processes I think that are interesting to capture that go beyond what we know from demography, that have to do with if I lose my job and I am a mother, how hard it is for me to find a job versus if I am not a mother, or if I am a mother of three, right? Like all of these factors play a role, and I don't think we're very good at assessing it yet. I don't think it's really easy either because households are extremely complex. And so even with this kind of like, all I can observe is once they have children, this is what happens, right? Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. We didn't find huge differences between age groups because we did look at that, which surprised me because I was expecting 0-3 to be much more at risk, but we did not find that at all. There's also like limitations in terms of the data. Like I did everything I could, but like if you start getting to like 7,000 households and who's poor and who experiences a change and then who has children, and it can become very small. But yes, it is one of the things I would like to look into more, and I thank you very much for your question. In terms of gender, fun fact, no gender differences in poverty risk in Spain except for retired women who are retired are more likely to be poor because they have lower pensions. But that doesn't mean poverty is not gendered. And I think, yes, it is gendered in all the ways we've seen, but just to kind of like the ways in which it's racialized, we do have much higher risk of poverty among, of course, migrant origin children. I'm going to refer to children because that's kind of fresher in my mind. Currently, around a third of children in Spain are born to foreign parents, but more than half of poor children are born to foreign parents. This is a new statistic from last year. Up until then, the majority of poor children were from here. And that answers part of the other part of the question, like, why do I not focus so much on migrants? Because I think it's important to recognize the particular risks associated with migrants, but also not to fall into the trap of poverty is the result of migration, and then there's nothing we need to do about it. Because it's not just that. There's definitely other processes going on. And yes, administrative status is a massive burden, and we can see how for a lot of households is a barrier, but also we found some mechanisms by which actually obtaining regularización, obtaining los papeles, threw them into poverty in different ways because they had mechanisms to cope. And then all of a sudden you have a regular income and then you lose, like your income is not necessarily higher, but you lose access to all the other support mechanisms, for example, food banks, etc. And then your resources may actually decrease as a result of that. So it's definitely a complex one and a very interesting one. We are planning on writing a paper on this, but we just finished collecting the data. This is the first presentation I'm doing with the results. And then self-identification, we did not collect income data, but we did collect lots of information on their living conditions, right? Are you sharing an apartment and you don't want to? Or is your house inhabitable? In some cases it was. Which kind of things have you gone without? Yeah, and all of those are indicators of poverty. So people tend to underplay no one is poor. Nobody's poor in this sample, in this room, and nowhere. But also people tend to underplay their experiences. Like, like a lot of people, even when they're reporting to you things that are by all means quite strong or quite like, they would be a struggle or economic effort. They're like, yeah, but we didn't do anything essential. We just like, stop quitting the house. We didn't go anywhere to do anything, but it's fine. It's normal. So it's very much, yeah, that would answer your self-identification. In some cases, we don't have income, but not for all of them. And then in terms of the barrios, they differ a lot in terms of family services. So service provision in Spain, family policy is very, very limited. And a lot of it happens through third sector organizations at the local level, meaning there's super strong variations in terms of which services. And like you can think, I said nurseries, but you can think to what extent there's public schools, after school projects, libraries, canguros, like all sorts of support. They vary from neighborhood to neighborhood. The strength of social and community organizations also varies tremendously. So for example, Poblesec, one of the neighborhoods we established, has over 180 organizations in La Tabla de Infancia, meaning they offer some sort of services for children. In Besos, they just started the Tabla de Infancia, and I think there's 8 of them. So everything you can think of, from like activities to your children to medical support, varies. And the last question we can discuss later. I'm still working on it. What do we learn from the quals to the quants? That's what I'm trying to do.
Okay, we have now a question from Maria Jose. I have a question, and then I think you two will be next. Okay.
Thank you, Alba, for the presentation. Very nice. I have 2 questions. The first one, I'm shocked with the teacher and the gardener couple for 2 reasons. Why should they be poor if they both have some kind of, it's not that very low status job, particularly the one from the teacher, right? And then I also puzzle, why should they take a full-time parental leave if they will struggle with income? I mean, what's the point of doing that? But first of all, full-time parental leave is very rare in the population as a whole. Very few people take it. But one of the reasons for taking this leave will be that they have very traditional views about what is the ideal care of the child. I wonder whether you go deeper in the reasons for some of the decisions and whether they are rooted in traditional views about the ideal care for a child. And then I think that a comparative approach is very promising for understanding dynamics of poverty. And for instance, the UK, that is a case that you know well. The childcare is extremely expensive, but still the poverty child is not that high as in Spain, right? I mean, it's not that high. So they compensate economically. So this goes a little bit against your final takeaway. I would like to know a little bit more your thoughts on that. Thank you.
So Alba, my question has to do with some of the myths that you mentioned, it's very nice that you mentioned them, because I think population discusses poverty and oftentimes those myths come up. And one that I've heard often is the myth of people are really not poor because of the underground economy. They're not reporting the income that they're not reporting. And I was surprised you didn't mention anything about the underground economy, which is also a unique characteristic of Spain. So my question is, will you be willing to comment on the role of unreported income? And then we have one more question, then another one, and then I think it's Jorge, and then we have like 8 already. Okay?
Poverty is always a popular topic, I find.
Thank you so much for the presentation. You highlight the importance of the existing of public services, but I think as a city councillor elected in Milan, I see a lot of similarities between different neighborhoods of Barcelona. And I think another aspect is the knowledge of these services and not only the existent. Do you observe differences in the knowledge of the existence of these services in different neighborhoods? And also, another question is, do the existence of schools, sport facilities, green areas, or other places where you can have a social interaction, so speak about the existence of these services, matters in poverty in different neighborhoods?
Oh, I already got 3. Oh, sorry. I am so sorry. Okay, yes, I get started. So this teacher and gardener, they seem to, yes, so we don't know why they took leave. We know they took 5 months, so I think they were probably waiting for the child to be a year old to be able to get into nursery. And I think that's a very common preference in Spain, not to leave young babies in nursery. Why are they poor despite being so these are on 2 salaries and 2 public salaries. These are the lowest or the highest end, if you want, of our the least, the more privileged or the least poor of our cases. And they just the reason we keep them there is because we have this self-identification. They experience this period, regardless of what it is, they experience this period of economic difficulty, right? And I think it's also interesting because if we have the information of them before that, and before that they were really like making ends meet, right? They bought a house, and there's this whole process. So like, it's good, they managed to buy a house, but a lot of it is like family support, like they got help from the family, but also they didn't actually buy the house they wanted. They bought a cheaper house, and then their family helped them refurbish it. And there's this quote where like, in the mornings we worked in our job, in the afternoons for a year we refurbished the house, because that's the only way we can afford to buy a flat, right? So it's families who are making ends meet, but also not living comfortably, right? And I think it's interesting that a 5-month period can really throw them under. I think for me, that's one of the interesting things about this. Regarding the UK has very high child poverty rates, not as high as Spain, but very high. They do have extremely expensive nursery services, and it's true they compensate with transfers. So we could compensate with transfers, but we don't, right? Also, the UK is really cutting down on benefits as we speak. So I expect child poverty rates there to go much, much higher in the near future. Then Veronica, about poverty myths. Thank you. Yes, it's one of my fights. I haven't talked about the underground economy partially because, but sorry, I don't know if I should wait or not. I go to the next one, maybe? Yes, I go to the next one. Sorry. So I don't know your name, but the guy from Milan. So you ask about what the families know about these services and stuff. And yes, several things here. It is, there's many barriers, many reasons why people don't access services. One of them is they don't know the services, but there's many other barriers, such they may not be suitable for them, or like they may not consider the school appropriate, for example, or the space. There's also lots of barriers to do with schedule, which times is available. Is this for people like me? Do I trust it? So there's many barriers that have more weight than the information barriers, although it is one of the things we found is like, because the system of provision is so diversified, like if you need to know about the 198 organizations providing services for children in your neighborhood in public sec, it's impossible, right? So part of it is also this kind of like a multiplicity of actors that makes it almost impossible. And in terms of how we solve this, we asked everyone, like, how do you access the service? How do you find it? And most is the big public services. So people access other services through schooling. So the school told me, the CAP, the nurse, the doctor told me, or I was looking for work. I went to this place where they helped me to look for work or helped me with like basic benefits, a food bank, and they told me. Those are the main entry points. And of course, from there, like there may be other informal routes. But that's one of the roles that public services play for us in the economy that we don't necessarily register usually. And then now, Veronica. Underground economy, definitely a part of the story. Lots of the people we interviewed worked in the underground economy, be it as a main job or as a secondary job. Lots of moms work in the underground economy, few hours here and there. It is a part of coping, for sure, for many families. And it creates all of the problems associated with not having any protection once those jobs close down, et cetera, et cetera. But there are loads of people as well who work the non-underground economy and who are poor, right? I think it is a part of the story for sure. And like this Maria lady who was working as a self-employed, like enters poverty partially because of that. But I do not think going to the other side, I do not think the underground economy is enough to cover, because the experiences we're seeing are still pretty desperate, even though they are in the underground economy, right? And a lot of people work like, yeah, I make 33 euros every 2 weeks because I clean a house. And yeah, sure, but that doesn't make a difference to household economies, really.
Hi, Alba. I'm Giuseppe. I'm a PhD student here at the UPF.
Hello.
Hello. I have a question about housing. I'm very curious about it. It's not only because it's my topic of research, like, like as people say, barriendo para casa, because I think it's like the main spending of households at the moment in Spain. And I'm very curious about if in the qualitative stage they have like reported an importance. They have reported the very importance of housing for households, in which degree. And I'm very curious specifically about if the situation has changed during the last years, like if they have found like a strong deterioration during pre-COVID and also post-COVID. Thanks.
Thank you, Alba. Amazing presentation, but I have one question regarding. No. I just I find a bit hard to fully interpret some of your main findings from the quantitative study, because if I understood correctly, you found that labor market events, explain this poverty dynamics, which is not obvious per se, but is extremely reasonable, given that you focus on households in which there is at least one working person. And I imagine, people work for many different reasons, but maybe the main one is that they need to work. So, it's extremely reasonable that, events in this selected population will cause changes in poverty. And here is my question, how this would look like if you focused on the others, those households in which no one works, because these are very heterogeneous group, I think, no? I guess there are some people that would need to work, but they don't. Some others that don't need to work. So, and how the importance of these labor market events would be if you focused on the general population, okay? All of them together. Then I understand that the project was for in-work poverty. So, yeah.
I have an answer for you, don't worry.
Hi, Alba. It's very nice. Actually, my question is a little bit related to Jean-Pierre. Actually, this idea that from what I got from your presentation, the first part is that it's short term. For many people, it's actually a short-term event, poverty. But that doesn't look like very reasonable to me. So it seems to me, so my question is whether this might be an artifact, partly, because pretty much it depends on being on the 60%, right? The line poverty. So it depends on the others, on the other part of the society. So partly, but more than that is actually whether, so you are pretty much looking at the line that's related to the focus that you have on the working, poor, on the line, people at the line poverty, or slightly high or slightly below. And so I know that the data only give you like 3 years maximum, but it may have been nicer to look at a longer period so as to identify the long-term people who go up and down, but they pretty much stay, not stay, but in the long-term run in poverty rather than this kind of short-term, because then it's misleading. It looks like, for some people it's actually only an event that happens, but for other people maybe something that more of a pattern on a long-term one.
Okay, now I have been able to count 3. So housing is huge. It's something we didn't ask about, like we didn't plan to ask about, and we didn't include in the interviews, but it's something that came over and over, like housing difficulties and increase in housing costs as one of the main determinants of economic struggle. Yes, it's huge. And I think to the extent that I think we really need to reconsider starting to use poverty after housing costs as our indicator, because it's huge. What happens to households where no one works? Happily, I have other research for you, but also a bit of my own data. So this has been done for everyone in the UK by Jenkins 2011, but also in Spain in the 90s by Olga Cantó. And they found the consensus is it's always labor market events that are the main factor associated with poverty entries and exits, mostly because most households have someone at work. Like this is maybe like, it's a majority of the population. And then if we look at households where no one works, the problem is we have on the one hand pensioners, and then poverty is pensions, and if the pensions are high enough or not, and whether they have household members depending on them. And then there's households where nobody works, right? And that's a very, very small proportion of the population, really. Partially because very few people can afford to not work, and partially because if they do, they're not in our survey very often, right? Like we don't have the extreme cases of people who are homeless or, but what I can show you is a bit the transitions between what in which condition were they before, and like, so they're inward poor in this year and last year. So how many of the people who are were poor last year were non-poor and work less, or poor and work less, right? So they weren't working last year, but they enter, like I have this proportion, or I have for all the years, I have around 9% of households where nobody works and they're poor, and then or not poor, depending on and 8% where they're non-poor. So yes, it's a part of the story, but it's a much smaller part of the story than entering and exiting poverty while in work. Here I don't have pensioners though. Here I have all the population, but not pensioners. So I think it would still, based on the literature and based on the size, I think work events are still the main determinant. Then Jorge, short term, absolutely. I wish we had longer data. We don't. From here, this has been recorded. Eurostat, please give us longer data. It doesn't exist. When it did existed, or in the countries where it exists, like in Germany and etc., we do still find poverty to be short-lived. Actually, the first people who realized this are some Germans. In 1997, they published with like their longitudinal data, and I think they had like 10-year periods. And there's still, for a majority of people, poverty is short-lived. There is people though who are in this kind of like our Daniel. Like he wasn't poor because he had the salaries, but they are kind of making ends meet. And those people are the people. But then it goes back to what do we define as poverty? What are we concerned about as a state or as a society, right? Is Daniel someone we as a society need to help? or is Daniel someone who's managing and then is not poor by our definition, right? So that's, I think there's the political always come back. I don't think it's an artifact from the, or it doesn't seem to be an artifact from the threshold. We've tried different thresholds. We also tried looking at changes in material deprivation. So yeah, whether people can afford basic necessities of life, and we still find it. Material deprivation is a bit more static, partially because it's the result of a process of erosion, is much more extreme, but still we find fluctuations. So it is maybe partially as an artifact, but not only.
Yes, thank you, Alba. This is a question coming from a non-poverty person, non-studying these issues, but you mentioned just at the very end the role of inflation and costs, and to what extent you really need this into the picture together with income. And I was wondering, how could you, not only in the qualitative part, but also here, take this into account? Now you mentioned this material deprivation, or I don't know, which measures do you, studying poverty, use to reflect those experiences or trajectories in which there's no change in labor market, in families or whatsoever, and nevertheless, they enter into poverty simply because of the rising of housing or other costs. And we cannot see this, and this could fit this idea of very short-term entries and exits from poverty, simply because it's an external impact. No? So probably it's an obvious thing I'm asking, but I was surprised to see these costs thing only at the very end, just as a final quote. That's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alba. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
It was really interesting, this presentation, and I think that it also shows why stories are important. So why listening to the experiences of people in this more complex way helps us understanding the phenomenon in a complex and in a very rich way, and also these multiple phases of poverty. So thank you very much, because it was very interesting. Also that you choose to explain specific experiences, like the example of the soup, for example. I think that they really help us understand the phenomenon of poverty in a richer way, and also to identify specific elements that might be also important to understand poverty beyond like the labor market. For example, how maternity or how a divorce may be like really important points where these things change, and to understand how poverty is configured. And my question was in relation to the interviews in themselves, and more also related to ethics maybe. So I just wanted to know if you can develop a little bit on how you manage this situation. So if you were doing the interviews at home, if they were shy to show you their places or not. So how was this moment of the interview specifically? And also for you as a researcher, what was your position in relation to these interviews, and what was your experience on that? Thank you.
After this third question, we still had also hands from Juan Carlos and from Aida, although we only have 7 minutes left. So we'll, if you don't have time to ask them.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of questions that I had some thoughts in following your discourse. So you said that poverty is short term, and also
for many people.
But then this is kind of contradictory to me if then the rate of poverty is very stable over time. So why did this happens? And my second question is, from your quantitative part, you suggested that labor market events are the key events. But then in your qualitative part, you put a lot of emphasis on like the role of benefits. But like how does it work? We shouldn't invest more on benefits, or we should invest more on labor market events? Right? Like what should be the take out of your talk on this? Thank
you. Okay. So in terms of, I always want to respond to the last one because it's like in there. Clara, yes. Costs. So the international poverty community has decided that poverty usually is, we measure poverty through income rather than costs. Why do we do that? Because the idea is that income is objective, while costs is something you decide on, right? You may decide to pay a super expensive flat or whatever. And then, so there's been like some pushback against using costs. However, there is an increasing recognition that things such as like the inflation crisis and the housing crisis we have are impacting. So things that we do, one of the things we do is measure poverty after housing costs. So we reduce housing costs, assuming this is something households can control in a way. I mean, you could decide to be in a super expensive flat, but in general, people don't if they can't afford it, right? Then material deprivation measures are also a way to do that, although in the case of the European indicators, they are quite extreme. And so in many, for example, there's countries where there is no material deprivation in the EU and Nordic countries, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a measure that is quite extreme in a way and doesn't capture a big portion of the population. And then the other thing for me where I would like research to go is to consider as well, and that's, I know it's I've said it already, but like things such as the healthcare system, education, et cetera, as resources as part of this income, right? Because otherwise what happens is, imagine tomorrow in Spain, we don't have public healthcare anymore. Families would be much poorer, right? But the poverty estimate would be exactly the same. It wouldn't change at all. So I do think we need to reconsider how we apply this. And there is some people we're on it, but it is not easy to agree, partially because of the political nature. Regarding the interviews and the ethics and whatnot, it was, we contacted interviewees through a range of processes and organizations and WhatsApp groups and mothers and fathers groups and we tended to do the interviews where we met them, kind of thing, as by familiar or like in rather than in their houses. And people usually felt more comfortable with that. We also arranged with Asociación de Vecinos and like charities to leave us some space. And that seemed to work quite well for the families. In some cases, we wouldn't have been able to enter their house because if they're sharing or they live in very, very poor conditions. How we approach the ethics is a lot of, we guarantee interviewers, of course, interviewees complete anonymity. We never talk about poverty. We try not to reproduce any stigmatizing discourses. And also I didn't do the interviews because I'm not a great qualitative researcher. We had extremely experienced people who've done interviews before with vulnerable groups. Who did that, and also we coordinated where possible with services. In some cases, we had, for example, even a mental health person in one of the interviews with us because we were talking about like more complicated things. So it was a very small ad hoc project. We didn't design like an official solution, but we tried to kind of adapt it to each of the situations a bit, and also to match the interviewers and interviewees in terms of gender, in terms of origin, and things like that could help as much as possible make them feel comfortable. And then now, yes, I'm coming for you, Martí. Why are poverty rates stable if people enter and exit poverty? Because a lot of people enter and lots of people exit. We have a very, there's many exits, there's many entries. And to an extent, poverty rates are the result of structural factors that don't like, it doesn't change much because of the economic cycle. It does a bit, but not as much as you expect, partially because of the statistical artifact that Jorge was mentioning. So because poverty the poverty threshold is linked to the median income. When there's a recession, the median income tends to decrease a bit, not as much as the average, and then it compresses, right? So for example, in the last recession, lots of pensioners exited poverty, even though their incomes didn't necessarily increased because median incomes for everyone else who works decreased. So a part of it is this kind of like the fact that poverty is relative and then it varies with the cycle. What they do is they use anchor measures. So what we do is, okay, if poverty threshold is at 2014, for example, or like whatever, what happens over time? And there is more variation to do with recessions, but still, in times of economic growth, we're not able to reduce poverty in the same extent, partially because the lower end of the distribution in the last 50 years in Spain has benefited less from economic growth compared to middle and higher end. So we would observe more increase in poverty during recession if we had this anchor measure, but it doesn't alter the fact that people don't exit. And that explains our kind of like long-term poverty rates. In terms of labor market and benefits, thank you, because it's one thing I think helpful thing to clarify. Why do I talk about benefits if I say it's labor market, right? Because the labor market, it is what it is in a way, right? We have lots of people who enter and exit the labor market. We have lots of temporary contract. We have lots of people in short periods of unemployment. When this happens, so we have two options. Either this doesn't happen and then we do need to improve the labor market, sure. But when this happens, what we can do as a social policy person is have benefits that allow you to cover those periods of unemployment, reductions, et cetera, et cetera. So, and our welfare system currently is very unable to support households who work. And there's changes currently going on with the Ingreso Mínimo Vital where they're compatibilizing, but it is one of the main barriers. People, when they lose their job, when they gain a job, lose benefits. When they lose their job, they take maybe 3 months to access benefits. And that means 2-3 months of no income. And then, so we really need to be able to do that. And also for households where there's a small variation in hours that makes a difference, maybe it's more practical to think, okay, I top up those 5 hours that you've lost. And then rather than thinking we need more jobs, yeah, we need more better jobs, yes. But it's they both work together, and thinking about which parts of the puzzle we can move, I think it makes sense to talk about benefits and their interaction with.
So Juan Carlos and Aida and others, please talk to Alba afterwards. Alba, thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation and discussion. Thank you very much.
Happy to see everyone.